you know, after that peak in about 2008 in ridership. And part of that has to do with this loss of service hours, but another part of it is just sort of congestion and the grinding and the unreliability of the bus network. The biggest declines on a percentage basis are in Manhattan, but that's not as big of a deal because we do have in Manhattan a subway system that is a very good substitute for, you know, probably superior in a lot of ways to the bus. But Brooklyn does not have as extensive of a subway network. So this is what sort of raised alarm bells in our mind to be like, okay, let's try to fix this because it will make a huge impact on people's lives. So one other note just about why buses instead of, you know, many other things is that the bus for many people is their first line of mobility and access to schools and culture and friends and shopping and all that stuff. It's often described as the mode of last resort, but I would say it differently in that it's often the mode of first resort for many people who don't have a car and are trying to make local trips often. So when you sort of see these huge ridership losses, you start to worry, are people missing out on sort of the benefits of living in a vibrant, diverse city like New York? And what we see when we look at, you know, commuting data is that, you know, the mode share for transit is actually increasing year over year. Now, to be fair, the, you know, work commute is not the only trip, and in many places, work commuting is now the, you know, much smaller part of the people's travel patterns. But it's, you know, still a huge part in New York, and I think it's about 60% of people in Brooklyn commute to work by transit. So if our transit system is failing, it has sort of large economic sort of repercussions, and just sort of in terms of accessing, again, the benefits of urban living, it has a huge dramatic impact on daily life. Okay, so I just wanted to show you sort of the 5 busiest buses in Brooklyn and sort of what has been going on with their ridership. In terms of graphical representation, you probably shouldn't ever represent data in this way. It's a little too dramatic, but I just wanted to get that sort of downward slope very clearly and dramatically represented. But these are the 5 busiest buses in Brooklyn, and they run on primarily the busiest avenues where you have shops and movies and housing. And then one of them, the B35, that purple line, is essentially a crosstown connector that connects to a number of different neighborhoods and a number of different subway stations. So it's a really important lifeline. And it's a bus, just so you know, most of these buses average, you know, during the peak period, like 5 to 7 miles per hour. It's, you know, really slammed by congestion and very unreliable, heavily bunched, just sort of as bad as it could be, I would say. So this, don't worry about this image, but this is just to say that we built out for our model the existing service hours budget. We got some data from the Transportation Workers Union, which is the union that represents, you know, all bus and subway operators in New York. And they were nice enough to share this with us because this is not normally publicly available. But we really wanted to limit ourselves and not go crazy just allocating, doling out service all over the city to all over Brooklyn when the budget wasn't there for that. So this was sort of our, you know, the limiting factor in everything that we did. And then this is just sort of showing you what bus routes look like in Brooklyn. We have it all. We have short feeders like the B74, which is in Coney Island, and it just is a straight line in a loop that serves a subway station. And if you look at sort of the load factors and where people get on, it's pretty much very light and then very heavy at the subway stop. But then we also have sort of insane circuitous routes that span neighborhoods and aren't really logical and are empty in places and then very busy in other places and then stuck in traffic and then going, you know, 10, 15 miles per hour. So the B103 is the one I've selected. This is actually one of my favorite bus routes. It experienced pretty dramatic growth over a 4 or 5 year period because of the opening of or the expansion of a new shopping center in East New York, and there's been a lot of housing development around it, and there's no subway in that part of the borough, but it connects all the way to downtown Brooklyn, which, I mean, there's no one who rides this route end to end. I mean, that would be insane. Okay, and then I just, what we learned from and what the sort of lessons we wanted to adapt are, this is the Nova Xarxa in Barcelona. As I mentioned, this was sort of the model for us. And what they did in Barcelona that was great is that they reduced the total number of lines in the bus network, but they really beefed up the frequencies. And the argument was that if you reduce the amount of time people wait, people will be more willing to take the bus. And if you reduce those total number of buses, you have to make it easy for people to transfer between buses so they can still get from point A to point B. And the transfer penalty is much less dramatic if the bus is running frequently and is reliable and all that stuff. So we really wanted to model ourselves after this. Now, I'll just note as an addendum, the Brooklyn bus network is being redesigned actually by the MTA sort of at this exact moment. And they put out an existing conditions report just recently that showed that transfers between buses in Brooklyn is actually very high, much higher than either Alon or I realized. When we were sort of putting all this together, the numbers we found were actually very low. It was about we found about 5% of people in Brooklyn transferred bus to bus, but that number is, I think, about 37%, so closer to 40%, which is obviously dramatically higher. But that supports everything that we're doing. It's saying that people are already willing to make that transfer. So we were sort of moving in the right direction anyhow. So this last sort of slide for this section, and then if anyone has questions, please click the raise your hand part now. This is sort of best practices from one of these transit advocacy groups. And so they recommend sort of redesigning the bus network, transforming how we get on and off the bus, and I'll talk about that, sort of signal priority for buses, all of those things, which are really no-brainers, very simple, just very difficult to implement, apparently. So with that, I'm gonna sort of take a brief pause. I'm gonna take a sip of my water. If anyone has any questions, click raise hand and I will call on you. Oh, so Ayush Pandey, please.
So I had a very small detail-oriented question. So you said that the buses go around 5 to 7 miles per hour during the peak hour. Is it taking the consideration the time they waste at stops, like deaccelerating and accelerating, or is it the cruise speed? And also, what speed do cars go during the same period?
Excellent question. So it does take into account sort of load and unload issues because it's a distance divided by time situation. And cars don't travel much faster. They travel also about 5 to 7 miles per hour. So the main conflict, right, is traffic in that instance. So I hope that answered your question. Professor Lee, I see your hand is up. Oh, I mean, Ayush, do you have a follow-up question? Or?
No, just thank you.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. Professor Lee, your hand is up. I don't know, and you're muted still, so.
There it goes. I was wondering the all-door boarding.
Yes.
How big of a difference does that make relative to things like let's say eliminating stops?
Okay.
Is the boarding time or the time lost to payment very large?
So I'm gonna talk about the results of everything we did in the next section. So I'll get to that. But one of the important things to note is it's all interactive. And so stop consolidation works really well with all door boarding. As you're mentioning, right? Because as you consolidate stops, as long as, people don't disappear from the system, you will have heavier loads at each additional stop. So if you don't do something to reduce the dwell time on people loading and unloading, you're just, moving the deck chairs on the Titanic, so to speak. So just to give a little bit of an example of this, in New York, in the 1990s in Brooklyn, they introduced sort of limited bus service on Flatbush Avenue, which is the B41 bus. that sort of is overlaid with the local bus that stopped every 10 feet or whatever it was. When I was writing my dissertation, which is about something different, I was able to scrape the travel times, and they were actually exactly the same between the limited and the local bus, because you had just sort of huge loads of passengers getting on at just fewer stops. So it didn't change anything. Any other question? Okay, no, looks like we're good. So I'm going to keep going. So this is just my attempt at being cute, but I follow New York City Transit buses on Twitter, and every day, not right now, of course, they tweet about how heavy traffic is delaying the buses. And as you can see in some of these, it's like, you know, dozens of buses are now being delayed. And the thing is that there is a way to solve this problem. We just need to actually do it. And sort of the politics of this stuff, which I'll talk about sort of at the end, is much more complicated than the sort of technical solutions. But we still have to start with the technical solutions. So here are our bus speedups. And so we found, so prepayment in our model it's actually a pretty small benefit. It only accounts for about 4% of our increase in speed, but it does lead to less bunching and more sort of stable bus travel speeds over time. And sort of the other part that I was mentioning is that it works really well with other interventions. So it's a really important component to get right. And so prepayment, for those that don't know, is when you pay to get on the bus before entering. So you can do it with one of those smart cards, or here in New York, what we do, which is very stupid and expensive, is we have this array of machines that we have to put into the streets, and people have to put their Metro cards into that and get a ticket to get onto the bus. But we are moving to a tap and go system that should be, I mean, things are delayed right now, but I see them on buses right now. They're not operable, but should be up and running sort of in 2020, 2021. During this coronavirus outbreak, what they're doing in New York for buses are totally free, and you enter through the back door. So we don't get any ridership information. We can get some travel speed. I haven't seen the data released on that just yet, but they're sort of moving to this prepayment stuff anyway. So then sort of going to this interactive effect, the stop consolidation is really the biggest key. And so average bus stop spacing in Brooklyn is about 700 feet right now. And if you look at sort of international comparisons, sort of best practices go about 400 to 600 meters, so about double what we do. And there are places that have, 1,500, 2,000 feet for their average bus stop. And it all makes sense as to why this would speed up the bus, right? The constant stopping and starting sort of adds delay to the travel time. And then each additional stop, because of the boarding and the lighting, adds an additional delay. So we wanted to sort of figure out how can we sort of speed up the bus, and that's sort of the key to all of this. The other reason why we focus on stop consolidation is that it allows the bus to operate more efficiently. One of the big critiques of transit is that on the labor side, there have not been sort of efficiency gains to keep pace with inflation over pick any time period, essentially. But one of the things that we would push back on, and other people recognize this, is that there are a lot of improvements that can be made that are outside the control of bus drivers and subway train operators. And that's sort of traffic, signals, payments. If you add all of these technological improvements, you can get your bus system to operate much more efficiently. And so you can get from the same amount of service hours, you can get a bit more service. And so that's really what we're going for. So bus lines. This is obviously a huge part of it. Going back to Ayusha's question, on Church Avenue, where the B35 runs at about 5 to 7 miles per hour, it's just really stuck in congestion. And if you can build dedicated lanes, this is an Xarxa bus lane, but as you can see on our left, there's a bunch of cars by the sidewalk, and the bus is running sort of in the middle of the road. And we also find that sort of median running bus lanes versus curb adjacent bus lanes, are much more effective because of the obvious conflicts that come up with left and right turns when you're curb adjacent stuff. One other thing that obviously I'm sure many of you are aware of is that the rise of sort of Uber, and in New York, that's been a doubling, a tripling of cars on the road, I should say, for hire vehicles, taxis on the road. That's also slowed things down, and had a negative impact on what's going on for our buses. So street redesign in general is just another enormous, enormous challenge. So New York, so let me just start again. Alon and I were fortunate enough when we sort of did this to present our findings and our redesign to the Department of Transportation in New York and the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. So the transit operator and the people who control the streets. They're not the same in New York, and that's a huge issue. And one of the things that we kept coming up against is that, okay, we need to reallocate where parking is. We need to move bus lanes into the middle of the street. We need to create islands. We need to create more shelters. We need to do all this stuff. And that's all outside of the control of the transit operator in the case of New York. In many cities, it's actually sort of the same. The MTA has quite a large purview compared to other transit operators in America. But in other countries, the people who control the streets also run the transit, and that's a very good marriage to have. And so what we find is that for some of what we'd like to do on our narrower streets is maybe have a two-way bus lane in the middle with one-way, because there are a lot of sort of one-way travel streets for cars in New York. But if you're connecting with a subway, it puts you offline on a northbound or southbound route potentially. And so you increase the amount of walking someone has to do. But if you could do a two-way bus lane on a Nostrand Avenue, which is a busy avenue in Brooklyn, you would allow everyone on the northbound, southbound to access the subway, which is a lot of what people are doing. And you'd reduce that walking, which is a sort of a huge, huge advantage. And then sort of the other big speed priority is transit, the big speed up is transit signal priority. The literature on TSP is pretty limited from what we found. And the cities that have implemented it and written about it, at least, do not have the same sort of east-west, north-south conflicts that New York does. So to highlight what I'm saying is Church Avenue, which runs east-west in Brooklyn, and Nostrand Avenue, which runs north-south, they're both high priority streets. And so how do you determine which street gets the priority is not inherently obvious. I mean, there are ways to sort of weight things, and you can make a decision based on ridership. But when you have very high frequency bus service, how do you decide who gets priority? But anyhow, we tried to be very conservative when we sort of estimated the benefit of transit signal priority, and that's why the range is between 4% and 7%. Okay, so if there are any sort of questions about those initial speed ups, now is the time to ask. Otherwise, I'll jump into some maps. I'm gonna take another drink of water. Okay. All right, that's fine. So maps are very exciting. So neither Alon nor myself are especially adept at maps, but we tried to make some. And this map that you're looking at is a centrality map of bus stops in Brooklyn. And as you can sort of see, well, let me step back. So if you don't know what that means, is that the big red nodes for the centrality map show where multiple stops intersect. And so the bigger the node, the more access you have to bus service in Brooklyn. And so you can see it's not evenly distributed, which maybe makes sense. There's this very strong east-west corridor, which is Fulton Street, Atlantic Avenue, those types of streets, if you're familiar. And then there's this very strong north-south corridor, which is Utica Avenue, eventually sort of parts of Flatbush Avenue, Nostrand Avenue, which I've talked about, Riders Avenue, so on and so forth. So you can see it's very sort of this L-shaped or 7-shaped focus right now. And if you look into the northern part of the map, this is where Williamsburg is, for instance. Not a lot of connectivity, and there's been a lot of population growth in that neighborhood. And then, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm looking at the East New York section, which is the part all the way on the right of the map where there are like some clusters of red and these blue dots. Those blue dots are the stops. There's been enormous development in that area as well. I think it's the second fastest growing part of the borough. Okay, so this is our redesigned network. I don't expect you to look at this and really understand anything unless you're very familiar with Brooklyn. So I'm going to walk through a couple different things. So one of the keys to all of this is that we wanted to deliver bus service 6 minutes or better on every single route from basically 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. So what you have is sort of from an American standpoint, extremely high frequency. From a New York standpoint, you have, very high frequency, but we have some routes in here. Our red ones are sort of, less than 6 minutes all times of the day, but can be as much as, every 2 minutes at other times. The green lines are always less than 6 minutes as well, but sometimes, it could be, 3 to 4 to 5 minutes during the peak. And then the blue is 6 minutes at all times. And so that's sort of the big shebang, is that we wanted to really ramp up bus frequency. And what we found when we looked at the existing network is that if you took sort of some averages, you get between 12, 15-minute frequencies for the system. And so this is obviously pretty much doubling that. And in order to do that and keep our service hours budget the same, we had to slash routes. And so let me just make sure I get this right. So in the existing network, I think there are about 54 routes. And in our proposed network, there are 37 routes. I should point out that there's a couple of the routes are completely new, and some of the alignments are just sort of mixing and matching existing service. But I'm circling a route that goes from Brooklyn into Manhattan that doesn't currently exist. And this is, I think, just fantastic, awesome, great idea of a route that takes, it's basically a one-stop shot from a neighborhood in Brooklyn that has very poor transit service into downtown Manhattan, where you have access to jobs, but also access to 3 or 4 different subways that could take you the rest of the journey. And it's just, that's such a no-brainer. And I really hope that if anything comes out of this, MTA just sort of does that. Okay, so let's take a look at some more maps. So one of the things that we talked about with stop consolidation is that we really needed to sort of peel away where we had our stops. Now, even though, I'm just going to go back up, even though all these black dots on this map are bus stops, we are perfectly okay with moving some of those dots. The ones that hit subway stations or places of interests, we shouldn't necessarily move. But the big thing that we do need to do is that where you have sort of what I've done a before and after on Church Avenue, which was what we were just talking about, instead of 5 stops over the span of a few blocks, if we could reduce that to these 3 stops, that's one way that you see your bus move much more quickly. You still have to stop in front of the subway station. But the other part of it is that if you cut some of the north-south service, like this B49, or if you move it all onto Nostrand Avenue, the north and the south, it means you're still going to connect with as many buses as you used to connect with, but now you don't have to stop in 2 spots to hit southbound and then northbound. You can hit both in just at one stop. And that's a very important, I think, goal of a bus network redesign in New York City. Another big part that sort of guided us was making sure that we didn't cut service where subway stations did not have step-free accessibility. Currently in Brooklyn, I think it's about 1/3 of subway stations either have ADA accessibility or will have ADA accessibility in the next, who knows how many years. But that means that you can't just cut a route where there is a subway close by, but it's impossible for someone in a wheelchair or with another type of disability to get onto it. And so there's a bus that runs on Fifth Avenue in Brooklyn, the B63, which Alon and I both thought was a prime subject for cutting because there's a parallel subway on Fourth Avenue, but that's this over here, if you can see it. But because of all of this, subway stations that are not step-free accessible, we decided not to cut it. But as that station as that line adds more and more accessible stations, we would say, get rid of that and redistribute that service to other parts of the system. While I know it sounds like I'm being pretty harsh and cutting and whatnot, I do want to be clear, we don't want to lose any of the service. We want there to be the same amount of service and maybe even more, sort of redistributed a bit more intelligently. That's sort of the main sort of idea. Another thing that we looked at was sort of income and public housing. So New York, as you might know, has quite a bit of public housing. That's what these sort of purplish dots represent. And income inequality is also sort of concentrated in certain areas. And so we want to make sure that our buses were still hitting, people that sort of definitely would depend on it, where it is their first line sort of mobility. We looked at land use as well. We looked at a lot of transit statistics just to sort of see what's going on when we sort of started drawing our lines. But these are the types of things that we were looking at. Another thing we did, we made our own map sort of points of interest and bus depots. And points of interest are going to be universities, hospitals, shopping centers. What else is interesting? I don't know, high school. There are a couple high schools in there too. And then bus depots are these black boxes. And so we really want to make sure that our bus network redesign wasn't all of a sudden going to cut something out that was, a dire necessity for people to have access to. So we tried to be sort of as thoughtful as we could be. So this is that centrality map, old versus new. Now, obviously, I think the new one looks much better. We cheat a little bit because we really are focusing on connecting with buses, on adjacent buses. So our map looks, obviously a lot better than the old one. Okay, I'm going to stop for a moment, take a drink of water. If there are any questions, please raise your hand now. If not, I'll continue on to the next section. Okay, excellent. Okay, so one of the things when I was talking to Professor Lee about all this, he thought that some of the work was interesting because it was geared towards being applied and being sort of put out into the world and maybe adopted. So when Alon and I started this project in 2017, what was going on in the world was Houston had redesigned its bus to sort of great fanfare and success, and other cities were losing bus ridership dramatically, and maybe other cities should consider doing this. We looked at the data in New York and we were like, New York should definitely consider doing this. And then in the summer of 2018, Andy Byford was hired by the MTA to be that president of New York City Transit, which operates the buses and the subway. And he came in with this very bold idea of sort of doing a top to bottom restructuring of New York City Transit. Now, you might think that this is something that happens every year. There's a sort of systematic review of buses and subways and saying, okay, we see ridership gains here, ridership declines here, let's rebalance things. That's not at all what happens in the real world, unfortunately. And so what Byford was proposing was redesign every bus network in each of the 5 boroughs. So again, as mentioned, New York has 5 boroughs. So this got underway just recently. The first redesign started in the Bronx. And what happened, the way this process has worked is that the MTA has held open houses in each borough for about a month. It sort of said, these are sort of the existing conditions. These are sort of some best practices that we're thinking about. What's important to you? Do you want to have a one-seat ride, or do you want to have greater connectivity around your borough? And then sort of taking that feedback and then drawing new lines. They've taken sort of this blank slate approach. If any of you follow Jarrett Walker, sort of the guy who did the Houston bus network redesign. And just to be clear, Jarrett's been talking about this for over a decade now. So the bus network redesign is not a new idea. It's just sort of only now sort of taking hold in America as a possible sort of thing to do. So as I mentioned, the MTA, they're having these open houses, soliciting information. They're doing, they've hired consultants to help them do an assessment of their bus systems. And then they put together a network redesign. And then they sort of let the public know. And they hold another set of public hearings, public meetings, and basically just get screamed at nonstop. I mean, I've gone to a couple of these. If you follow this at all, sort of this summer in Queens, they sort of did this process and they released the design in the fall, winter, and it's just been elected officials sort of screaming at them, the public screaming at them, like no one really understanding the changes that were made. And that's a communications problem from the MTA, but it's also, I don't know, I mean, you guys are interested in transport. People are so protective of their bus stop, their parking space, the daily life that they know. And one thing that happens at these forums is that any kind of change is seen as terrible. I've looked at their bus network redesign in Queens, and I think there are some problems with it, no question, but it's not fundamentally all that different. And one of the things that it asks people to do is to, instead of taking the subway from one neighborhood to another neighborhood in Queens that might be very far away, it's take the bus to the subway and take the subway for the rest of that journey. So it does ask you to make a transfer. It also asks you to transfer between buses. So in order for the MTA to sort of have the credibility to do that, other changes need to happen, right? Like the bus has to be able to be reliable. The subway has to be reliable. Those types of things are required. And so in Brooklyn, they just started this process. They released their existing conditions report, which is phenomenal. It's been so exciting to read this for myself over the past couple of months. And because Alon and I sort of were at the forefront of calling for this redesign, they actually invited me, because I live in New York, Alon lives in Berlin, to do some of the redrawing of lines with them. And so they just this winter in January, I think it was, we had two or three all-day sessions with bus planners, other people at the MTA, the consultants, bus operators, DOT, the Department of Transportation, just sort of like going over, okay, what do we need to make sure that we're connecting? What is this data telling us that's interesting? And so on and so forth. And as I mentioned, one of the things to me that was most interesting is that the bus-to-bus transfer numbers in Brooklyn are off the chart. More people in Brooklyn transfer bus-to-bus than bus-to-subway, which, I mean, to me, that was enormously illuminating and enlightening, and I was just amazed to actually learn that. Okay, so that's sort of the end of the presentation. I don't know if these links, you can access them through Zoom, but my email's up there, Alon's email's up there. The link to our bus network redesign report is up there, which has our formulas actually for stop spacing and stuff like that. If people want to talk more about that, they can check there, or we can sort of talk about it in question and answers. But that is all that I have prepared for you. So if there are any questions, please raise hands and I will call on you. Okay, Ramez.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting. I was just wondering, you touched on it a little bit, the rise of ride sharing. I think my parents live near New York, so I spent a lot of time there. I think one of the toughest things was always before ride sharing was cabs were hard to get. Like you actually had to wait quite a while. Now you can get an Uber in 2-3 minutes. So how much do you think that played a role in the decline in ridership? And do you think that that's something that this will change, that more people would choose transit over rideshare just because hopefully the wait time's reduced?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I am not in the camp that thinks that Uber and Lyft are sort of peeling off transit riders at an unsustainable number. When you look at ridership data in New York, it's high, a few 100,000 rides a day. I think maybe maybe it's up to 600,000 rides a day now on Ubers and Lyfts. But those numbers, it's taking a huge hit out of yellow taxis, a huge hit for hire vehicles. And I don't think the demographic profile of a bus rider and a Uber passenger are that similar. But I do think that Uber contributes to traffic. I think that's sort of been demonstrated by Bruce Schaller and other people. And I do think that has an impact on bus ridership. And so I do think that there are bus riders who opt for Uber. Absolutely. I do think that's the case. I don't think it's an enormous number that is alarming, but I do think that they contribute to traffic congestion. And so I do think that that's a problem. When I talk to bus operators, one of the things that they complain about is sort of people dropping off and getting into cabs sort of at the curb. And that interferes with their journey. And so Uber is definitely part of that problem. What I hope happens, and this is something that I think there is precedent for. I think if you look at London, the demographics of who rides the bus versus who doesn't, rich people ride the bus in London, people with briefcases and suits. That's just not really the case in New York. Your average bus rider is older, less educated, makes much less money. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips right now. I should have. But the average subway rider in New York is pretty much the average New Yorker. The average bus rider is not. So I do think that if the bus were more reliable and people could get where they need to go, then yeah, more people would take it. I think that, in a city like New York and other cities where people do rely on transit, that people are so starved and hungry for a way to get around that they'll, tricycle share would be popular in New York, unicycle share, whatever. Like people just want to go somewhere a little bit faster than walking, or with, less exertion. So I think it would be, a huge benefit.
Thanks. Yeah, I actually just had a quick follow-up. Sorry. No, I just had a quick follow-up. So all those, you were saying that those transit ridership, you don't think that those people, those New Yorkers who are taking ride shares were using transit before as much? I mean, that it's mostly not caused the decline. So what mode were those people choosing? But I mean, yellow cabs were, like I said, kind of hard to catch and long waits. So what mode of transportation were those people using before, in your opinion?
Well, so I think it's a couple different things, right? So I do think it does take some of the transit share. I do think that just also it allows for trips that normally weren't happening to happen as well. Because when you look at sort of the decline in yellow taxi ridership and for hire vehicles, which is, black cars, the growth in Uber and Lyft is even a little bit more than that. But I also think, it does probably take away some driving trips that people would make in New York. It's not something I've thought too much about, but when I've interviewed bus passengers, and so I wrote my dissertation about dollar vans, which are basically these vans in Brooklyn that mirror the bus, but are faster and more reliable, and they cost $2, not $1. When I interviewed a lot of those passengers, they were just like, taking an Uber is way too expensive. I can't afford a $10, $15 ride versus taking transit. So I just find it hard to believe that a huge group is sort of migrating from, buses to Uber.
Good, thanks.
Yep. Antoine.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. You mentioned reliability a few times, and I was just curious, what kind of strategies does the bus agency use to control over the bunching?
Well, the transit agency really doesn't do anything. So they do have dispatchers who have the ability to sort of put a bus in place or to tell them to, skip ahead or stop or short turn. They do have some of those, they do some of that stuff.
Okay, yeah, that was my question. Yeah.
But one of the things I mentioned is that the Department of Transportation controls the streets. And so in terms of putting in bus lanes or putting in transit signal priority or, stuff like that, that's not the MTA's, they don't have the ability to do that. They work together. They just blame each other for all the problems. And I'll just say from my experience, I'll just tell a short story. So in New York, we have something called Select Bus Service, which is like bus rapid transit, but not as good. And they were building a route in Brooklyn. It's on Kings Highway, if anyone is familiar. And in the original design, they were going to take, I think, 180 parking spaces to build a bus lane. Camera enforced, not physically separated. And the city council member from that neighborhood and local businesses all sort of freaked out, and they're like, you can't do this, it's going to kill local business. That's always the argument. And so the MTA had to restore a number of those parking spaces. Now, this is a bus that moves 25,000 people a day. So fighting over 180 parking spaces is, from my perspective, insane. And this is a fight that happens every single time they try to introduce any sort of improvement. So yeah, it's very parochial, these fights, and people really complain a lot about losing parking.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I think we've hit our 2:30 mark with a minute to spare. So I don't have anything else left to say. I hope you're all enjoying your lockdowns responsibly. Please feel free to email me or email Alon or check out our report and get in touch. Professor Lee also can get in touch with me if need be. But thanks for having me. And I want to thank Noel, obviously, as well for sort of putting this together and walking me through some of this. And I think I spoke to Javier as well, who had a great background on his screen when I talked to him. But it's very helpful because I've never done anything like this before. And I'm very sad to not have made it out to Champaign-Urbana, but I'm looking forward to a guided meditation.
All right. Well, Eric, thank you very much for joining us for our first Kent seminar of the quarantine era. It's very successful. We've had, at one point, I think we had 30 people on the call. So I think there was a lot of interest in your topic, and you did a very good job. So thanks to you for educating us about all this. It was really a pleasure.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Have a good rest of your day. And everybody, let's do reactions. Let's do clapping reactions at the bottom of your Zoom as a show of applause.
What?
I just gave you a clap.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I don't know what your professor's talking about, but I appreciate it.
Down at the bottom, so I'm clapping, giving you a thumbs up.
Oh, I see. I have no idea what you're talking about.
I see several. All right. In any case,
all right.
Have a good rest of your day, Eric. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.